To be completely honest, I'm just not quite sure why I'm reviewing this film. I mean, I'm clearly not part of the target demographic. However, in an effort to prove that not all film critics and cinephiles judge every film using the same exact set of standards, I guess I'll take a look at it. Now, what I mean by that is that there are some people that think that film critics and particularly cinephiles don't understand the idea of demographics. We do. A lot of my friends and I, we understand when we're not the target audience for certain films, but even when you look at a film that's meant for a younger audience or even just for a demographic that's not you, you can still spot flaws in it. And speaking of the flaws, I think a lot of them can be attributed to what went on behind the scenes with this film. Most notably when Al Pacino decided to drop out as the villain and basically threw a huge wrench into production because they had already begun animating. He'd recorded all of his lines, but then he just dropped out partway through, and then they decided they had to basically do damage control, and so they brought in Benjamin Bratt to come in and dub over the lines, which was a pretty good move on their part. But given the way this film looks, it definitely shows that Pacino leaving partway through production definitely had an impact on the film. That said, let's get started with this week's episode of Romney's Reviews. Now, I haven't seen the previous film, but watching this, I didn't really get lost or anything. True, there were references to the events of the previous film, but there wasn't a lot of information that was wholly dependent on the viewer having seen the previous film. So, in that regard, I didn't get lost, so if you haven't seen the previous film, you don't necessarily need to in order to understand what's going on with this. But other than that, the story in this film is fairly lacking, even by family film standards. The biggest problems I had with the story, one was the fact that there were just so many subplots and just pointless scenes that were added to the film that just kind of slowed things down. And then the second thing is that a lot of the comedy and slapstick, particularly with the minions, which I personally found kind of grating, basically slowed the film to a really screeching halt. I mean, I understand that the minions were fairly popular and their antics were kind of, well, funny, but it's just the case when you're literally stopping the film to show antics with the minions. That's a problem. I mean, the biggest guess that I could give is that they probably had a much larger story or just a much more intense story planned, but then they figured, okay, we'll add this funny scene here, or then we'll add that funny scene there, and then it got to the point where all the comedic scenes and the comedic subplots kind of overpowered the main story. Now, bear in mind, there are some good comedic bits, but when the film is constantly stopping for them, it gets old really quick. Even when you see the resolution of the main story is still kind of weak. The biggest problem is that it doesn't really have that much of a climax, mostly because you're not quite sure which story is supposed to be the main story. And a lot of it feels rushed. It feels like they just bounce through so many different things all at once while allowing for more of the comedy and not so much for the story. And that's ultimately what it felt like. It just felt rushed and kind of boring, which is weird, but I'm guessing since they rushed through so many parts of the story and don't even really have a proper climax, it's just the case that you're just not really given much incentive to really care about the characters unless you had seen the previous film. If you really like the characters, you may enjoy it, but all in all, there's not much to the story that's really worth it. Now, the only thing I can really knock the film on from a technical standpoint is the excessive amount of 3D pandering, mostly because I watched it in 2D, and it just bothers me when a film almost tries to rub it into your face and almost kind of mock you for not seeing it in 3D when it has a lot of stuff meant for showings in 3D. And so that's the only real technical aspect that I can kind of knock it on, because most of the problems really come from the story. I mean, the cast was good, but it was just the case that even with the lines and some of the comedy, it's just the case that the script was pretty weak. That's all I can really say about this film. So overall, it was just a whole lot of meh. I mean, there's some good comedy bits, but there's not really enough of a continuous story to really carry anything. Even when you've got like the shoehorn romance subplot between Gru and Lucy, it's just a case where you're just like, why should I really care? So unless you've got kids that are absolutely dying to see this film, you're probably better off waiting for this to come out on DVD. On a final note, the way this film is written and paced, it feels a lot more like a TV movie than it does anything else. I mean, even with like the way it's like paced, it feels more like something you would watch on a Sunday night movie network television program than in a theater. All that said, on my personal scale, I give Despicable Me 2 a 3 out of 5. Again, if you got kids, they'll probably enjoy it. It's definitely for younger audiences, but as a film, it just doesn't really hold up. So that's it for this week's episode of Romney's Reviews. As for next week, well, I'm kind of excited, mostly because I'll be reviewing Pacific Rim. See ya then.